No, all my family's down here now, which is kind of sad.
Ladies and gentlemen, hello.
But it's nice to have them close by.
I'm Davis Farmer. I'm the president of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here this evening. I see a lot of familiar faces, but for those of you who aren't familiar with the World Affairs Council, we're a nonprofit organization which was formed, in fact, 70 years ago to provide informative programming on international affairs and matters outside the U.S. that affect the U.S. We're a non-profit and non-partisan organization, so we don't take positions on things. But frankly, I think we provide some really terrific programming. And I say that not because I'm on the board, but I'm on the board because we provide such great programming. We would love to encourage those of you who aren't members to join. The World Affairs Council is super cheap and a great bargain. And if you have any interest in joining, you can go on our website, or you can talk to Tim Horgan, our executive director, who's back in the corner. We have a great staff. We have a lot of volunteers who do a lot of work, and we'd be delighted to have more. So please consider becoming a member if you're not already. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our really terrific executive director, Tim Horgan.
Thank you, Davis. All right, I'm going to make it hard on Maheen, and I'm going to walk a bit. So, as Davis said, my name is Tim Horgan. I'm the executive director of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. We are a non-profit, nonpartisan organization, so we do not take any stances on policies, politics, candidates, all of that fun stuff that we get to say every time and nobody actually listens to. But we are an organization that is centered here in New Hampshire with a global reach, and we are trying to help people better understand the world by taking the time to be at the forefront of global conversations. So thank you for everyone who joined us here tonight in person, for you joining us online or watching the recording. We really appreciate you taking an interest in tonight's first of the T. Williams and Patricia Ayers Global Tipping Point series of 2024. I can't believe it's already 2024, and March, by the way. We are here as part of a three-part series entitled Making Sense of the World. We know that there is a lot of chaos, a lot of challenges, a lot of various things that you may or may not understand why they are happening, how they are happening, and who's doing what. So we wanted to bring together a great panel or series of speakers to talk about different ways that we can approach the world, frameworks that we can use to better understand what is going on and why decisions are being made in the way that they are. So tonight we kick things off with a discussion of the realist school of thought approach. I've been told it's not a theory, but it is a great way to really sort of try and start to make sense of the world in certain ways. It is not a be-all, end-all approach. We'll explore a couple later this spring, but we hope you'll be able to join us for those events as well. So our wonderful speaker tonight is Dr. Jonathan Kirshner, the professor of political science and international studies at Boston College. His research and teaching interests focus on international relations, political economy, politics, and film. I had a wonderful conversation with Neil about some of the documentaries we've shown in the past. His current research includes projects on classical realism. I loved your discussion about, I don't think the Beatles were thinking they were writing classic rock when they were writing it, but we're really excited to have the opportunity to hear from Dr. Kirshner about realism, what it is, what the different forms of realism are. So I'll turn it to you, Doctor, to give us a bit of an intro to that, and then you and I can have a little conversation, and we'll bring the rest of you in for Q&A in a moment. So, Dr. Kirshner.
I'm kind of a shouter. I know I don't know if I can do the whole.
Well, just for the online audience.
All right. Well, you tell. Well, now I got to be a one-handed speaker. All right. Because my little notes. It's going to be a challenge, as they say in French. All right. So, as I understand it, my remit here is just to make a few framing comments, and then we kind of open it up to questions, discussion, and conversation. So I'll be as brief as a professor can be. But again, they've got the cane handy if they need to stop me from talking. So I'm just going to talk to you about what the heck this whole realism thing is. And first I want to tell you a little secret about us realists. We love the name realism because it's like branding, right? If you're not a realist, then what are you? Unrealistic, right? So that's already you've won half the battle. So watch out for that. These kind of realists strutting around, implicitly suggesting that if you're not a realist, you're not realistic, and that's not true. And I'm not a proselytizer. I'm not telling you to be a realist. I'm here to tell you a little bit about what realism is. And the best way to do that is to say, all right, realist looks out the window. What does a realist see? A realist tends to look out the window and see countries. It's the first thing a realist will see looking at the world. And irritatingly, we call them states. So if I say states, I mean countries. I don't mean like the states of the United States. And we see those states, I'm going to use that word, as dwelling in anarchy. Another confusing word that we throw around a lot. First thing important to know about anarchy is that it is not chaos. They're two very different things. Chaos, of course, the organization of evil featured in the TV show Get Smart. Whereas anarchy simply means a lack of a supreme authority to adjudicate disputes between states. Okay, so states dwell in anarchy, and that kind of defines the condition in which they exist. If two actors within a country come into conflict with each other, there's a kind of legitimate structure of conflict resolution that they can appeal to, but countries in the world, not so much. The realist also looks out the window and tends to think that states are defined is not the right word, that states commonly have conflicts of interest about which they feel strongly. That these are not misunderstandings, that they simply have conflicts of interest. I want this and you want that, and we kind of just disagree, because of the pop song. Worse than that, a realist thinks that when states disagree, the possibility that these disagreements may be resolved by the resort to war exists. And worse still, because we dwell in anarchy, and therefore there's no one around to kind of enforce rules, although behaviors of others will not necessarily be unconstrained, it might be. We can look around at the TV and see lots of horrifying unconstrained behavior out there. Why? Because there's anarchy, and so there's no kind of global police to stop this behavior from taking place. And then finally, a realist tends to emphasize the fact that as for the future, we don't know what's going to happen next, right? So the title of my book is called An Unwritten Future. So obviously I think that uncertainty and that lack of knowledge and the lack of a possibility of that knowledge is very important for a realist school of thought. All right, so those are the kind of the foundation, the building blocks of a realist approach. But what, as a practical matter, what does that mean for a realist? Mostly it means that states, countries, whatever you call them, countries, I'll call them states, must be alert to the capabilities of other states. If it's anarchy out there, and war is a possibility, and unconstrained behavior is a possibility, then we kind of have to know what the capabilities of others are, because we may come into conflict with them, and those conflicts could actually lead to them doing nasty things. And so states also, because of anarchy again, need to be alert to possible threats to their own physical security. And also, and this is a little more subtle and gets into some policy questions that you might want to talk about later on, in thinking about what foreign policy choices or defense postures to kind of produce for their societies, they're very much aware, realists are, that there's no sort of end zone in international relations. It's not like you solve one problem, there's going to be another problem coming up behind that, and then behind that, and behind that. So international politics is unending, and so when you think about how to address a current problem, you need to be aware that there will be future problems after that. Again, resolve one conflict, before you know it, another will be looming, right? It's a 2-year trip from the end of World War II, an epical war, to the start of the Cold War, which was kind of a bummer for the people at the time, who thought that kind of solved all the world's problems. So realists also tend to focus on what they see as the realities of power, the capabilities of others, and also, this is important, the limitations of one's own power. So I look out the window, I see others with capabilities, I'm also aware not only of their capabilities, but of my capabilities and their limits. And because of that, realists take some, I'm going to say, exaggerated pride, because I think that this can be overstated by them, us, in the phrase, seeing the world as it is, rather than seeing the world as we would like it to be. That because others have power, and because our power is somewhat limited, and there are going to be things that are going to happen in the world, and that's just the way it's going to be, and there's nothing we can do about them. And we need to kind of be aware of, again, the dangers of the world and the limits of our own power. And this also means some pretty discomforting things. Realists tend to see a world in which foreign policy choices are difficult and tend to be morally compromised. Often because it's not about saying, I know what the right thing to do is, let's just do the right thing. Often it's about choosing between what looks like probably the least awful option. And there's a lot to be said for that. If you're faced with a bunch of options and one of them is the least awful option, that's better than choosing an awfuler option. Realists are often described as being somewhat pessimistic, and I think it could be an example of the pessimistic flavor of realist thought. All right, so I have my pom-poms out for that. Realism, yay, yay, yay. But there are some problems for realism that I also want to alert you to, which I think are very important. First, we need to distinguish between the way realists describe the world and realists' prescriptions. That is, what we should do. Okay? Those are two very different enterprises. Telling you what we see when we look out the window and then telling you what to do about it are two different things. And even many realists tend to conflate these two concepts, descriptive and prescriptive analysis, and it's not a good thing. A realist sees a dangerous, amoral world in which others' actions may be horrifying and barbaric. Some realists, hopefully not many or most, but some realists say, and that's why the international political world is an amoral place and you check your morals at the door. No, that the one does not follow from the other. It may be that you have to make bitter compromises, and it may be that you're not able to do everything that you would like to do, but you don't actually get to check your morals at the door just because others have done so in international politics. It's more of an awareness of the fact that that's a possibility and that behaviors take place in this morally compromised place or space. And so I do think it is almost an Achilles heel of realism as practiced by many to say, well, the world's amoral, so foreign policy can be amoral. And all I'm asking you to do is put a wedge between those two things. Recognize the first, but be a little cautious about the second. Another thing about realism has already been given away. You gave away the store in the introduction, which is realism is not a theory. Realism is a disposition. Realism is an approach. The technical word they use in kind of professor talk is it's a paradigm. It's just one way of understanding how the world works. But there is no realist theory. There can be many theories derived in a realist tradition, but there's no realist foreign policy. Oh, here's the realist foreign policy. Realists will often disagree with each other. How do I know this? Because I know a lot of realists and we often disagree. We have seminars and then we fight about it. And we're all realists and these have policy implications. And each of us reaches, drawing on realist traditions, comes to very distinct kind of causal pathways and expectations about what will cause what. So yes, realists, let's pat them on the back. They broadly oppose the war in Vietnam. They broadly oppose the war in Iraq. But that's pretty low-hanging fruit. Most questions of international politics, are more complex and compromised, again, than those easy ones. And that's why realists often tend to disagree. But I'll throw you a bone here, and I'll say that this realist disposition does yield some shared insights into how the world works. And I think most garden variety realists would probably say, yeah, I think you're right about that. Although even there, sometimes there can be disagreements. So look out the window and see the real world, and you see China. Most realists will be China pessimists. Not because there's anything inherently problematic about China as China, but because realists tend to think, not all, but the overwhelming majority of them, that as states become more powerful, they become more ambitious. Okay? Not as a universal law, but it's pretty darn close to one that we have in international relations. So we have a bunch of countries in the world, and there's a status quo, and they set it up, and they're really happy with it. And then there's a country that's getting a lot more powerful, and it says, well, what's so good about this status quo? No one asked me to build this status quo. I think we should be doing this, 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 and this instead. And by the way, I'm 10 times more powerful than we used to be, so you should listen to me. That has nothing to do with China. That's what every emerging great power has ever done, including the United States, for hundreds and hundreds of years. So because a realist tends to think that with increased power will come increased ambition, they tend to be, maybe anxious is too strong a word, but very wary and cautious about the consequences of the emergence, or if you prefer, re-emergence of China as a great power. Looking at another part of the world, with the Russia-Ukraine war, I think that a realist would say, yeah, this illustrates a lot of what we talk about when we talk about realism. First of all, obviously, you've got your anarchy, you've got your unconstrained behavior, you've got your barbarism, right? So that's just what we said the world was like. Obviously, there are other parts of the world that aren't like that, right? You have most U.S.-Canadian relations, I presume. I know we're close, and maybe a sensitive topic. But it's not quite the same as, say, Russia-Ukraine relations, but it does seem to be illustrative of anarchy and acts of horror. But also this question of uncertainty, of not knowing what's going to happen next. Most experts did not think the Russian invasion would take place the way that it did. I knew a lot of them, and none of them said that was going to happen. Most military analysts did not think Ukraine would be as successful to this point in resisting that attack as they were. Again, another surprise. But realists expect to be surprised because we don't know what's going to happen next. And most important, the attack had unintended political consequences. For example, the expansion of NATO to include Sweden and Finland. I mentioned the political part because realists may look out the window and see a world in which wars take place, but those wars only matter to realists to the extent that they affect political outcomes. This goes all the way back to some guy from the 19th century called Clausewitz, he's often paraphrased as saying war is a continuation of politics by other means. That's not the important thing he said. The important thing he said was you can only understand success in war to the extent that it achieves the goals for which the use of force was introduced. So having Sweden and Finland join NATO is actually a cost of the war, a significant cost of the war to Russia that might not have been factored in to their calculus when they started it, no matter how the war as war ends up. And again, focusing on politics, I think a realist would look at what I would describe as the erosion of the American international order that was constructed after the Second World War and kind of hung on for about 75 years and now seems to be at a minimum fraying at the edges, will have political consequences for the United States that will be, that the United States will regret. One is that one thing that American order did was it served to enhance U.S. political influence in parts of the world. So we can anticipate that with the erosion of that order, America's political influence, which matters narrowly in a self-interested way, the ability of the U.S. to get what it wants on the world stage would be reduced if its political influence is reduced. And then, back to that nasty pessimistic part of realism, as U.S. power recedes from the world, and I want to be clear, there are parts of the world I'd love to see U.S. power recede from, so it's not that realists simply just want the U.S. to be everywhere. What's the movie? Everything, Everywhere, All at Once? That's not the realist prescription either. Remember that admonition I gave you about being aware of the limits of one's own power. That describes the U.S. as well. Nevertheless, as American power and influence recedes from the world, political nature abhors a vacuum, and other actors will step in to assert their political influence, and often those actors will be actors with whom the U.S. sees its own interests as in opposition to. So those are just some quick illustrations, and hopefully I've given you enough to kind of get a conversation going over some of those things, but I'm happy to talk about anything that I'm competent to talk about, which is substance. of world events. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Kirshner. That's a great starting point. And as I have found through my career of hosting these conversations, I love asking questions. So that's a very dangerous thing to say. You'll answer any question I have, but I do appreciate the narrowing of that to that you're competent on. So we'll start with a bit of a conversation. And listening to your talk, one of the things that I can find instructive is we can identify things by what they're not, sometimes better than by what they are. And so your question of, well, if you're not a realist, what are you? So how do you answer that question? What is the antithesis or the other options out there that if you're not a realist, what are they?
So I think the most important competing paradigmatic, is that fancy word, school of thought in international relations, that is kind of contra realism, would be some version of liberal internationalism. And this can be overstated. In the 1990s, and like most of you in this room, I was there, we in international relations had a terrible time fighting endlessly between these paradigms of realism and liberalism, and it really was not extremely productive because it became a caricature, one of the other. So think of it more in terms of not a yes or no or a binary thing, but a spectrum. So what I said was that realists emphasize the consequences of anarchy for shaping world politics, and that they think that war is a real possibility, even though it might not occur. So a liberal internationalist, or just a liberal, maybe internationalist is an unnecessary modifier, would not say, no, there's no anarchy, and they wouldn't say, no, war is impossible, but rather they would say, yes, international anarchy exists, but there are many ways of mitigating it beyond what realists think. Often they point to the productive role of international institutions, for example. Or they may say, yes, war can occur, but it's pretty rare. And so if we want to build an approach to understanding international relations, building the town hall around the fear of war might really miss so much of world politics that takes place in spheres where war is less likely, right? We can look at so many countries in which we don't really think war is in the even distant future between them. And also, I think it's fair to say, although I don't want to step on any liberal toes, that this issue I raised about problem solving and conflicts of interest. I do think realists tend to see two countries disagreeing with each other and their default setting would just code that as a conflict of interest. You want this and I want this, and we're going to have to find a way to figure out who's going to get more of what they want. I think for a liberal institutionalist, especially those liberals who think institutions matter a lot, they see these conflicts more as kind of bargaining problems that can be overcome. And so again, it's not that they're in fundamental disagreement with each other, but it's rather how they look at the same things and emphasize different factors. Liberals might also look at the ameliorative consequences of international trade, commerce more generally, cultural exchanges, as creating important disincentives to international conflict. I don't think savvy realists fail to see that that's a possibility, but they're skeptical as to how decisive that would be. And what realists love to do is say, oh yeah, what about World War I? Because that was a gigantic, horrifying war between highly interdependent countries. But that's like whistling or knocking over a straw man, because yes, World War I did occur. But that doesn't mean that enmeshed interdependence between states isn't possibly ameliorative of the conflicts between them. So.
Yeah, no, that's great. And of course, it's always hard to prove that negative of the wars that never happened. But let's talk a little bit about international institutions. We have the UN, we have the International Criminal Court, we have any number of word soups you want to put out there. So what is the realist take on their role, if any, or are they just sort of out there whistling Dixie?
So the default realist setting on international institutions, and I would reach more for, say, the International Monetary Fund or the World Trade Organization than the UN or the International Criminal Court, although they're certainly very important international institutions. the default realist setting is to say that they are instrumental of power. So that some country set up the institution to advance its interests, and that institution will matter as long as the country with the power behind it is still there, sort of steering the ship. I happen to think most realists, or most unsophisticated realists, take that argument too far. And so there's a lot of good literature from realist-friendly schools and from liberal schools that have more of what we call the Frankenstein model of international institutions. That, yeah, some great power created these institutions, but after a while they kind of animated and became somewhat autonomous on their own. And again, we want to be a little subtle and sophisticated about this. Does that mean that institutions will stop this from happening, or prevent, this from happening, or enforce these rules? I think the answer there is no, no, no. But if you ask the question differently, saying, are the prospects for international cooperation greater with the presence of these institutions, even in the absence of the great power behind them? I think the answer is obviously yes. I mean, I don't know, I do not have a strong position on some of the agreements reached by the World Trade Organization, but it does act as an autonomous entity to a much greater extent than a default realist would have predicted at the time of its origin in the early 1990s.
Okay. Then sort of taking it down one level, one notch, bilateral, trilateral, multilateral relations, allies, do these relationships matter? Do they stay static? Do they change? What's a realist approach to understanding alliances and their importance in this crazy messed up world we live in?
I think most realists take alliances very seriously. Now, this is also where we kind of fuse some concepts, because some even refer to alliances as institutions, security institutions, which I do not. But nevertheless, can a realist hold the view that the presence of NATO over 75 years kept the peace within Europe, one of its original purposes, and also made it less likely that Europe might find itself in peril from outsiders? I think most realists would say yes. Similarly, the US-Japan Security Alliance, I think most realists would think, has been enormously productive. You can go down alliance by alliance and say, well, I like this alliance and I don't like this alliance, but it is actually better to have functional alliances than not. A prominent realist by the name of Stephen Walt, now teaching at the Harvard Kennedy School, his first book was a nifty little book called The Origins of Alliances, and he had this great chapter. It was during the Cold War, this book was published, saying, you call the world bipolar between the US and the Soviet Union, but notice that the US has allies like Germany and Japan and France, and the Soviet Union has allies like Mongolia. And then this made a difference in understanding kind of the balance of power during the Cold War. And so I do think it's fair for realists to take alliances very seriously, although always a realist would not be too far from kind of an interest-based understanding of the endurance of those alliances.
Okay. One other thing that I'm kind of wanting to bring into this conversation is around how we can, of course, use the realist approach or paradigm to understand the choices that are being made on our behalf as American citizens, or pick your country that you want to apply this to. So one of the big things, I was just reading an article in Foreign Affairs about the age of amorality, which nicely ties with what we're talking about today. And it was saying that, in the Cold War we had support for all of these authoritarian dictators around the world, which would seem to contravene our moral interests. So where do realists sort of try and find that balance point between amorality of the world, as you mentioned, without going so far down that we can just do whatever we want and not have to worry about the consequences?
Well, like I said, I do think this has been a real problem for realism, or for practicing realists. So I just want to preface this by saying you look at the American order that was forged after the Second World War, and what the fears were at that time, and what was accomplished by that order, the successes there are astonishing. And if you told the forgers of that order that this is what the world would look like 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years later, they would have said, wow, that's the greatest, you're dreaming. That we couldn't possibly get outcomes that good. Okay, but at the same time, as you note, there are a lot of horrifying things that the US did over the course of those decades. Some of them may have reflected those morally compromised choices, which is, well, it's the real world, and and my hands are going to get dirty no matter what I do. Even inaction has moral implications. And so the US did cozy up to some despicable characters around the world in the name of maintaining the American order and fighting the Cold War. I think there are some realists, and let's call this the Henry Kissinger problem, who enjoyed that too much. Again, who said it's international politics, and therefore morality is irrelevant. And that's what I wanted to warn you against, that there still needs to be a moral weighing of the choices that are made, even as we know that some choices are going to be unpleasant. And I think it's fair to be critical of US foreign policy in saying that it was perhaps a little cavalier and reckless in some of these nasty choices that it made. But this really is part of the world. I mean, before the American order, FDR referred to one South American dictator saying he may be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. And that actually mattered because into World War II there were concerns about German political inroads into South America. And so maybe it did matter that whoever was governing some of these countries was friendly to the United States, even if they were nasty mothers.
Yeah, and I think it was illustrative in this article that they were talking about exactly that if we didn't support a horrible, terrible dictator, then what was the alternative? We would love to say the alternative is, oh, some great and wonderful leader would come in and everything would have been better, but we don't know that. We don't, as you said, we don't know what the future holds. So how do you, with recognizing that you don't know what the future holds, you don't know what your policy decisions are going to have as unintended consequences, and all of that, how do you start to make decisions if you have no idea where things are going?
Well, first I want to respond to your implicit question before we get to what's next, which is, I do want to just re-emphasize that recognizing that the world is a dangerous and morally compromised place is not a get-out-of-jail-free card. That you still need to understand the moral implications of your behavior, even if at times that will require you to do things that walking down the street you would rather not do. But again, not a get-out-of-jail-free card. Now you've raised a wonderful question here. What does realism tell us to do? And here is yet another Achilles heel of realism, because realism is great at telling you what not to do. So realism gets real gold stars for the Vietnam War and for the Iraq War. The prominent realists of the day were just so early and active in opposing that war when most people hadn't heard of it, and then when it was still very popular. So we're talking the early 60s and the mid 60s. The war becomes unpopular around 67, 68. But a bunch of people you never heard of, like Hans Morgenthau and George F. Kennan, they were like fighting against this war again in these two phases. Very early on, when no one even knew what it was, but even in like 66, Kennan is testifying before the Senate, as a minority position, arguing against the war. And similarly, I do not think I know a realist who did not say, that Iraq war you're planning, that's probably a bad idea. And again, it gets back to that no end zone question, right? Realists would say, okay, you're probably a little stronger than Saddam Hussein's military, and so you knock him off, and then what? What happens the day after tomorrow? And there really, there was good reason to believe that the day after tomorrow was not going to look good. And that's the realist emphasis on the unending nature of international political conflict made them a little more reluctant to go on a rather wild adventure. But it is a problem for realism that it's better at telling you what not to do than at telling you what to do. It's great to walk around saying, don't make stupid choices. And realism, again, because of its respect for the limits of its own power, and because of uncertainty, and because of the world is a dangerous place, tends to be associated with this word prudence, which means a tendency to be somewhat cautious when confronted with a problem. But prudence can be paralysis. I just lauded George F. Kennan for his Senate testimony in 1966 opposing the Vietnam War. But Kennan was in government in the early 50s, and he opposed a lot of really productive things that the U.S. was ambitiously doing around the world as it was forging its world order. And as I said, and that was like a spectacular success. And what Kennan was saying, oh, we want to be prudent, oh, we want to be careful, oh, we don't want to overextend ourselves. And so I don't have a short and snappy answer for, here's what the realist tells you to do. In the category of telling you what not to do, I do think that realists want to focus on where interests lie. And I think realists, as I've said, want to focus on the limitations on one's own power. And so if you look at the US security guarantees in the Persian Gulf region, you can make an argument that those made really good sense in the 1970s. But given American power, American energy production, and a host of other factors that we don't need to dive into, if you were building from scratch today an American grand strategy, you would be hard-pressed to be able to make the positive case that it would involve a security guarantee for the Persian Gulf states. I think I'm hard-pressed to think of a realist who would think that that guarantee made sense. Of course, unwinding existing commitments is a little trickier than not making them in the first place. But I do think, in terms of at least one policy I can gesture at, I do think most realists would want to see that particular commitment abandoned.
Well, it seems like realists' victory laps are not that much fun, because it's always, I told you shouldn't have done that, and now look at the horrible mess you've made.
Yes, and they do say that a lot.
Yeah. All right, so I have one more question before we turn it over to the audience, both here live and in person, or online. If you have a question online, I'm going to pull out my phone so that I can check our email and our chat function. I am not checking the sports scores, although I don't know anyone who's playing tonight. So my final question before we turn it over is, if you're sitting here in the audience tonight, or if you're watching our recording, what is the takeaway from the realist approach in the current world we live in today? What is the one thing you want people to come away with from this conversation?
That's a great question. I'm going to take a moment to
Sure.
think. And my instinct is to reach for the classical realist. And there are different types of realist schools, and I'm a classical realist, which is different than the predominant school of realism, which is called structural realism. But the classical realist Arnold Wolfers, or Wolfers if we must, articulated a notion of something called milieu goals. And realism tends to focus on the dangers of the world and the possibilities of war and the struggle for survival, right? I said all those things. But actually, most states, countries, and especially most great powers are not insecure, right? The U.S.'s physical security is pretty assured. We've got, good, some oceans. We've got a pretty powerful economy, a pretty capable military. We've got a robust nuclear deterrence. When we get up in the morning, we don't say, we better get to the border, sorry to mention that word. But, you know, we do not need to defend ourselves from the invasion of the armies of another great power. And that's actually true for most great powers most of the time. So what Wolfers said, and I think this is brilliant, and I think this is a contribution realism has to make, is that most great powers most of the time are not thinking about their survival. Their policies and their foreign policies are designed to shape the way the world is to make it amenable to its values and the countries with which it chooses to associate. So one of the things that was so successful about the American order was the way in which the countries of Western Europe and Northeast Asia in particular were able to kind of thrive in the environment that was fostered by the United States. And someone who was counting up the dollars and cents of that would say things like, well, gee, the US spent some money supporting that. But the realist, who would again always put politics first, would say, but what were the political outcomes and what were the political alternatives? And the US did, in fact, with all the blemishes that I think is important to acknowledge, did create a world that reflected the successful pursuit of what Arnold Wolfers in 1960 called milieu goals. And I think that another phrase that could be used to describe that is enlightened self-interest. Note that the word self-interest still exists in the phrase enlightened self-interest, but it's more of a longer view, right? What's best for me as I dwell in the world over time? Is it a short-term transactionalist, I will take what I can get now and anybody else, the heck with them? Or is it, am I going to try and participate in international politics in a way that is conducive to the long-run advancing of my self-interest? And so I think that'd be the realist wisdom I would wish to impart, all the way back to good old Arnold Wolfers.
Well, good. All right. Yeah. Wait for the mic, and just so that the online audience can hear. Please introduce yourself.
My name is Dick Sweat. I'm a former member of Congress and former ambassador, so I appreciate your comments. I have two things that I would like you to consider in this milieu of realism that you've put before us. We did vanquish the Japanese and the Germans in the Second World War. And I would posit, just for the sake of this discussion, that the kind of dictatorship that Germany was under, the kind of emperorship that Japan was under, those are realist regimes that are looking at making their own mark in the world and benefiting by all of whatever they can capture in that process. So I would say that they are realists, and if we weren't realists before that, we had to become realists to deal with them. But the difference is that after we won that war, we then spent a great deal of money in the Marshall Plan, which is not really a realist's approach to fixing the problems that were created by the war. And it was through that investment that gave us the opportunity to build relationships, to create new economies, et cetera, et cetera. So what I'd like you to do is to think about the two wars that we are currently watching right now. And do you think, number one, that Ukraine has an opportunity of winning or at least reaching some agreement with Russia that ends the fighting? Do you think that there is a way that Israel can ultimately deal with Hamas? Or do they deal with Hamas like we dealt with the Nazis, and that is obliterate the organization, and then what happens next? And I'd like to know how you put realism versus idealism versus Marshall Plan versus investment in the future in those two circumstances. Thank you.
So thanks for your questions, and I mean this sincerely. I'm honored by your presence and very much appreciate you attending this talk and putting forward those questions. It's a treat for me to hear them from you. And I want to do the first stuff first, and then I'll get to the second stuff second. first I want to say we tend to shy away from saying this was a realist state, that wasn't a realist state. Because, you know, realism is just a way of saying this is how the world tends to work. And once we get into the kind of this little piggy is a realist, this little piggy is not, we get, technically as academics, we get very nervous about that. But I do want to say somewhat cutely that if they were realists, boy, they were bad at it, weren't they? I mean, their foreign policies led to their utter destruction, right? They led to the one thing that realists say states care most about, their physical integrity and their domestic autonomy. And they embarked upon a foreign policy, which I would call more reckless than realist, that actually led to the loss of both of those things. So that I think is a very big deal. And then on the post-World War II experience, this gets all the way back to that, well, not all the way back, let's go slightly back to that comment I made about narrow transactional self-interest versus enlightened self-interest. Why was the US so gosh darn generous after the Second World War? Because it was trying not to make the same mistake twice, right? So that after the First World War, that was decided by the US entry into the war, and the US side won. And then the Americans said, you know what, we find the international world less interesting than we did then. We're going home, and not only that, give us our war debts. We lent you money, and give it back to us. Or as President Hoover said, they hired the money, didn't it? And the international financial system is very fragile. And the US insistence upon the repayment of its war debts actually contributed to the global financial crisis of 1931. That contributed to the rise, did not cause, but contributed to the rise of fascism in Europe and in Asia. And the US short-sighted protectionist policies in that era also contributed to the spiraling down of the world economy. And also, in the minds of many at the time, contributed to the factors that led to the Second World War. So, when they finish the Second World War, there is still a debate in the United States about what do we do next. But this time, the engaged internationalists win. And they win mostly, I think, because they can point to the fact that we tried it. You know, you may hear the phrase "America First" is bandied about these days, but it was invented by those who didn't want the U.S. to enter the Second World War in the first place, by isolationists and by those who thought the U.S. could safely withdraw from world politics and tend to its own garden. But that really seemed to have been a catastrophic failure in the interwar years, and that was a lesson that informed the U.S. embrace of internationalism after the Second World War. And so I agree with you that the Marshall Plan was extraordinarily jealous and doesn't sound narrowly realist. But actually, if you go back to that Wolfer's milieu goals, it was central in shaping the world the U.S. wanted to make. One of the subtle things about the Marshall Plan was not just that it was very generous and not just that it stopped Europeans from starving to death, which it did, but also that it shifted the domestic balance of political power in a lot of these societies, I'm thinking especially of Italy and France, towards wanting to participate in the American international order. That didn't have to happen. Other political outcomes were possible in those countries. So it doesn't look really realist to give people lots of money after the Second World War, but in fact, I think had Arnold Wolfer spoken to that, he would have said, yes, this is what I'm talking about when I say you want to engage the world in a way that makes it more amicable to your vision and your long-term enlightened self-interest. So I do think the whole World War II thing is important in clarifying that less kind of, rough and tough version of realism that we often think of when we think of realism. We have interest in wars and tanks and stuff. But it is ultimately about advancing interest, and there are lots of different ways to do that.
Yeah, just to hop in there on, before you get to the second part of that question, just a little follow-up on soft power. The idea of culture, the idea of international exchanges, which we do, but if you're going to say bad things about it, that's fine. Where do realists fall on those sort of outreach soft power in terms of shaping interests and shaping people's actions?
It really depends. I think it will vary from realist to realist. I mean, there are a lot of, there's a spectrum of realism. So you have some realists, out, kind of pounding the table and would mock soft power. But the concept of soft power, I don't know if it was invented by, but it was certainly most elaborately articulated by Joe Nye.
Who lives here in New Hampshire.
Yeah, and who I don't think would be offended if you called him a realist. I think he likes to he likes to think of himself as a very middle of the road kind of a person, kind of intellectually, politically, and all those things. But I do think that, I'll phrase it this way: there are lots of realists who would mock what we call soft power because their emphasis is on hard power. But I don't think that soft power is incompatible with a realist vision of how the world works. I mean, in Joe Nye's phrase, hard power is about forcing others to do what you want them to do. And Nye says, soft power is about getting others to want what you want them to want. And that kind of influence, if it's successful, is probably more enduring than behavior that's changed reluctantly at the point of overwhelming power. Great. But I do want to duck your questions on Ukraine and Gaza, but I won't. On Ukraine, what's going to happen? I have absolutely no idea. I mean, I'm so astonished by how most military analysts, of which I am not one, got the first phases of the war wrong. And by the first phase, we're talking about 2 years now. And so, as a non-specialist in military affairs, it would be foolish of me to venture a guess as to what's going to happen next, especially because my book is called An Unwritten Future. It does look like it's going a little worse on the battlefield for Ukraine. I think most realists would tend to think that a negotiated settlement is going to have to be the way out, and that settlement will be a very bitter pill for most Ukrainians to swallow. And it's not that a realist would like that. Again, it's back to that phrase I used earlier on. Not seeing the world we would like to see, but seeing the world as it is. And so it is the kind of power dynamics at play between the two countries that will shape the ultimate outcome of the conflict. That said, and you didn't ask me this, I do think it is plainly in the U.S. national interest that Ukraine do as well as possible in this war, and that support that the U.S. can provide, short of participating in the war directly, which I do not think the U.S. should do, would advance American interests. That it is good for America if, when a country like Russia decides it wants to invade and absorb a country like Ukraine, it struggles to do that, and it's extremely costly and looks like a really bad idea, than if, in fact, it looks like it's quick and easy and fun and successful. I think America is better off living in World I than World II, and I'm a little surprised at the extent to which many people don't see that. I picked on Henry Kissinger before, and I think it's appropriate to do so in most settings. But he said he didn't like working on the Middle East because he hates to fail. And so there are no short answers to your question. But I do want to articulate some realist observations about the war. One is that the initial attacks by Hamas were obviously designed to, these were horrifying attacks with the types of barbarism I was describing that realists think can happen in the world, and which I don't think the average person is adequately attentive to. These were acts of brutality that you read about in Thucydides' The Peloponnesian War. And in human behavior from time immemorial. Just, I'm not going to rehearse them here, but horrifying. Why? Realists tend to think that things are done for a reason, usually a political reason. And I do think that as a non-expert in the Middle East, I do think that the attack was designed to elicit a horrifying, brutal, disproportionate response. And I think it was successful in doing that. And for a realist, the question would be, is the current way in which this war is being conducted advancing the long-term national interests of Israel, which will still have to live in a neighborhood and in a world indefinitely if it's going to continue to exist. And in that perverse sense, that horrifyingly barbaric initial attack was to some extent achieved its political goals because the Israeli response to date has, I think, unlikely advanced Israel's political prospects internationally. And, you know, to editorialize a bit, my suspicion is, not being a military expert, that there were different and better ways to conduct this war. And I say that again as a realist who thinks this is a very complex and morally fraught situation, and we ought not be under any illusions about, you know, what the aspirations of Hamas are with regard to Israel, and that Israel has to reckon with that on a daily basis. But the question reduces always to what measures should I introduce to advance my political goals? And again, in this particular conflict, the complexities and the moral ambiguities are as fraught as any that you will see anywhere in the world. And that's something that a realist are really, really attuned to. And one of the disappointing things I see in the public debate about this is that each side, at least in the American public discourse, is 100% confident that it's 100% right. And I'm 100% confident that they're both wrong about that. And that, again, this is just a extraordinarily complex, morally fraught situation. That how it will be disentangled, I don't, you know, is not obvious to me. And again, I speak to you in this context as very much a non-expert on these particular matters.
Okay. Yeah, Nickel.
My name is Nickel Marshall, and my question is not nearly as intellectually in depth as the Honorable Mr. Sweat's question. One point you didn't make quite clear in your speech: can realists disagree as to whether to go to war or not? And if so, can you provide examples of the last half century or so?
So that's a great question. The short answer is yes. Realists can disagree. Realists, all we do is disagree. I don't know if I can think of a really good example of a good 20th century war, at least from the US perspective. I think most realists are probably in on the first phase of Korea. They would have thought it foolish to advance beyond the 38th parallel, as was Kennan. They were bitterly opposed to the Vietnam War as just a terrible, terrible idea, and they were right about that. And similarly for the 2003 Iraq War, maybe there was potential for disagreement in the first Gulf War, but it's not on the tip of my tongue. But I will give you a good one. Realists disagree, I think, about NATO. So there's a very good realist by the name of Barry Posen, and he is associated with a realist school of thought known as restraint, and he wants the US to carefully and cautiously disentangle itself from the NATO alliance. Why? For a good realist reason. He thinks, so a realist looks out the window, and one of the things they think is that states don't like to be pushed around by other states. And so because of that, they think that if states can, they will build up their own military capabilities to resist other states. And Posen's argument is that the European states have been sort of free riding on American security guarantees, and if the Americans withdrew those security guarantees, then the Europeans would build up their defenses, and the world would actually be an even safer place. That's a good and legitimate realist position. But there's another good and legitimate realist position that says the opposite, right? Which is, yeah, the US probably bears a disproportionate share of the burden of the NATO alliance, But again, to go back to the post-World War II thing, but it's kind of a bargain, right? How much does it really cost the United States to be active and the leader of NATO? And do you really want to run the experiment of finding out what happens when the US leaves Europe? Again, back to the unwritten future, back to uncertainty, back to power vacuums being filled in ways that are less predictable. For example, some people, not Posen, whose arguments I think are tight and consistent. I know Barry pretty well, and we fight all the time. You know, don't phrase it in this way, but there are, I think, some cavalier opponents of NATO who just say we'd save a ton of dough if somehow, you know, we just pulled out and the Europeans spent more. I personally do not expect U.S. defense spending to drop if the U.S. withdrew from NATO. So it can't be about saving money. It has to be about whether U.S. in NATO is a wise, and I'll use that word again, international political idea, right? Are U.S. international political goals best served by participating and even leading NATO, or are they best served by abandoning NATO and withdrawing from it? Again, I've kind of come out of the closet as someone who's a deep admirer of Arnold Wolfers, and if you look at the U.S.'s milieu goals around the world, I think NATO has been a very strong example of how, yes, there are costs involved, but what have been the political benefits of that? Some large, some subtle. I mean, when you look, we talked about the nasty things the U.S. has done, but if you look at the wave of southern Mediterranean democratization that occurred in the 70s and 80s, a lot of those countries aspired to join NATO and other institutions, and it was understood that they could not do that until they shifted from autocracy to democracy. NATO is a club of, well, we'll see what happens with Hungary. NATO is allegedly a club of democracies, and so I'm thinking now of Spain, who joined NATO, and that helped kind of reinforce that vision of the world and of comity between a certain type of similarly situated countries.
Without the U.S. and NATO, NATO would never agree to anything. I've sat in those meetings, I've listened to these people. They have no joining force, no reason for them to agree with each other.
Yeah, I mean, it's a ball game. I mean, I do think Barry Posen's arguments here are deductively sound. I'm closer to the view that I have less confidence in the coherence of European politics and security with the withdrawal of the U.S. And the U.S. presence in Europe is much smaller than it was, earlier on in the alliance, especially with the end of the Cold War. We don't really need 300,000 U.S. troops on the inter-German border because there is no inter-German border, and so the footprint is considerably smaller already. And I'm similar to go to the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. I don't know. I don't have it on the tip of my tongue again where Barry stands on that, but to me, it's obvious that the benefits of that alliance outweigh whatever costs it might entail.
All right, I think we have time for one or two more questions. We do have some online, but yeah, Davis, we'll go to you.
Just a quick question, kind of a follow-up to Dick's earlier question. So you've addressed most of the things I wanted to ask, but one question I'd like to pose to you is, are any of the people, world leaders today, and I'll include former President Trump in this, people who you would characterize as realists? And if so, how would their realism impact things going forward?
That's a very interesting question. It's easy for me to put former President Trump in the non-realist camp. I don't struggle with that. But then going down the presidents and saying realist, non-realist, realist, non-realist, I think President Carter, for very different reasons than President Trump, is not easily characterized as a realist. but it doesn't come quickly to me.
Forgive me, but I'm talking about people like Benjamin Netanyahu, Vladimir Putin, Premier Xi, people who are actively involved in some of the tenser situations that we deal with today.
So I'm going to set aside Netanyahu for a second, and I'll just do Putin and Xi. And what they are is personalist authoritarians. And so personalist authoritarians are generally mostly concerned with the consolidation of their kind of domestic power and cult of personality. And much of what they do is about being wary of domestic sources of opposition. But we do call them strongmen for a reason. They tend not to be inhibited in their willingness to use force. I think more Putin than Xi to date. Should they see that it's in their interest. And personalist authoritarianism, which is a phenomenon that is global, and it's very interesting to think about why that is. I don't have a short answer for it, but we can see the rise of personalist authoritarianism everywhere. And I don't want to get all wacky on you, but it has a certain hyper-masculinist quality that we can often associate with a certain style of militarism, and that therefore we can see perhaps leaders like that being less inhibited from getting into a fight, meaning international conflict. But is a hyper-masculinist, personalist authoritarian who's trying to build a cult of personality, is that what we mean when we say someone's a realist? I mean, for me, no. I mean, the classical realist practitioner was Bismarck, and his brilliance, and I'm only modestly familiar with Bismarck, but the brilliance of Bismarck was in the way in which he manipulated political coalitions on Europe to bring about what? That thing realists crave, which is political influence in Europe. And so his wars, when he fought them, were cautious, small, and usually executed for limited gains. And many people argue that it was when Bismarck left the scene that German foreign policy became clumsier and more aggressive and more like the kind of policy we were just tarring Putin and Xi with, and that led Germany to disaster. But who was the realist? Was the realist Bismarck, or was the realist the kind of clumsy militarists who followed him? And I do think that, realists tend to revere Bismarck for his savvy, subtle use of force and political manipulation, and knowing not just when to introduce force, but understanding when not to, and understanding when to stop. That to use force to achieve a limited gain that achieved a political goal. And so again, to simply equate realism with some sort of macho or toughness or militarism or aggression isn't the way I think most realists think about realist behavior. But I do think that realists say, as I said at the very start of my comments, maybe this brings this full circle, the world is full of extremely dangerous, ruthless people who would not hesitate to exercise force in horrifying ways, and we need to understand that and be prepared to anticipate how that might happen and how to parry those threats that might emerge. But I'm reluctant to call such people, those other people, realists.
All right, I know the hour is getting late, and I appreciate you all joining us, but I do have one final question that has come in online from Kat Ayers Mannix that I think is important for us to tackle before we let you all go. She wants to know, what can realists do, what can realists say to encourage young people and people of all ages to get engaged with the world, to want to be involved, despite all the pessimism that we see and that perhaps realism tends to be associated with?
Yeah, it's tricky. I mean, realism is associated with pessimism, and there's a little fight in the community as to whether that's, you know, a coincidence or an inherent part of the disposition. But I think, in a more productive way, what a realist would say is that the world is there, and we are in it. And we're better off trying to engage it in the most productive way that we can if we want to do good things. And I guess, and I don't know if this is exactly the question, but I do want to get back to this issue of moral ambiguity. If I was looking at this hypothetical young person who wants to engage the world and make it a better place, I think I would say to them, the realist would say to them, that that's great, and you should, and I encourage you to do so. But there's not always going to be, as I said earlier, the obvious right thing to do. Well, here's what the right thing to do is, and then just do it. And if it only wasn't for other bad people within my own policy, we would just do the right thing. But for some reason, they want to do the wrong thing. Rather, there are lots and lots of compromise choices, and most foreign policy choices are about trying to navigate through those enormous, complex, compromise challenges. And so, do it. Get involved in the world, but I guess a realist would say, but do it with a certain amount of wariness as to how simple and easy world problems really are.
Well, and to highlight that, thank you all for coming to our programs and for being engaged in these conversations, because it is important that people understand these big issues that are going on around the world. You can't know whether or not good decisions are being made or the least bad decisions are being made, perhaps, if you don't know what's going on, why it's going on. And that's why we're here. So thank you so much for joining us. Please help me in thanking Dr. Kirshner for his time and insights.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
And I hope you'll join us for the future events. March 28th, we'll be back here on campus down the street for a conversation about Ukraine. We have a great panel together on that, including a woman from Kherson who's an activist and a fashion designer, which is kind of an interesting approach. But we'll have a great conversation there. Our next event in this series will be on April 24th. We have Ambassador Mark Starella talking about liberal internationalism and why allies matter, in his opinion. So it'll be a great conversation. And then we're working on our third one. We need to confirm our speaker. So we'll have that out to you as soon as possible. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a great evening.
Thank you all again.
Okay.